Hello friends. Before I start this video, I just wanted to ask you all for a little bit of help. I'm putting together what I think will be a pretty fun video idea, but I do need a little bit of input. If you could do me a favor and suggest some of the wackiest types of builds you can come up with in the comments, I would be incredibly grateful. Now, on to the video. Copycat has been out for around a month now, and I would say that the hype has finally died down, but I don't even know if there was any hype to begin with. I think most people were confused by the deck when it was released. They were either confused as to how to make it work, or simply confused as to why it was added in the first place. While it no doubt has some interesting abilities, a majority of the final cards for it are pretty uninteresting or just horribly balanced. On top of that, it seems like almost all the Copycat builds play incredibly similarly. While this would be expected for any other perk deck, it seems wrong for the customization deck to feel this way. While a handful of supposedly good setups have been found, I've found them to not be incredibly interesting. Builds like Max Health Socio, Max Dodge Burglar, and Max Health Grinder all don't distinguish themselves too heavily from already existing playstyles. While some say they're better, others say they're worse, I just find them to be primarily uninteresting. With that in mind, I tried coming up with some Copycat builds that utilize the deck a bit differently. Instead of going for the most OP builds, or the ones that play the most like existing playstyles, I wanted to use Copycat to give some stability to builds that are generally considered a little gimmicky. While people can argue back and forth about perk decks like Biker being viable on Death Sentence, most people are in agreement that decks do have a certain way that they should be built. Health decks have health, dodge decks have dodge, and armor decks have armor. My goal here is to turn that notion upside down with the help of some of Copycat's boosts. I'm going to take some existing builds that don't rely on Copycat, and can often be very fun to run on their own, but kind of level them out a bit. Generally, these are builds that struggle in one area that Copycat is able to kind of patch up for them. In exchange, these builds will usually lack at least one unique aspect of their original, whether it be increased damage, unique techniques, or healing. There is something to be gained by playing both versions of the build. And to that extent, I would specifically describe these builds as side grades to their originals, with an emphasis usually placed on survivability. Now the builds that I'm going to be revamping are Zerk Rogue, ICTV Hacker, Sociopath using the Vulcan and RPG, and finally Frenzy Muscle. The final thing I'm going to say before showing off these builds is, holy fuck, I hate the forced heal on headshot on this deck. It ruins so much fun, and for a deck that's literally built around trying to fucking make all of the types of decks viable and trying to give you so much creativity, why the fuck they decide to just completely destroy any Zerk below Frenzy is beyond me. Up first is a build that I originally made as a joke, until I realized just how damn good it was. Frenzy and dodge decks generally don't really go too well together for just a whole handful of reasons. The main issue being that you trade off survivability for just a little bit more damage, which is a trade that is rarely, if ever, actually worth anything. This is of course where Copycat brings a little bit of assistance. The 2-second God mode can occasionally work as grace protection, and just generally helps when RNG isn't really on your side. I try not to use this build too often anymore because I find that it's actually just a little bit too OP for my liking. However, I've been using other versions of it that I find a little bit more fun. As this is a specific version of this build using specific weapons, I'm sure many people are aware that lots of other weapon types work well here as well. I've recently been really enjoying using the Raven and Judge with a more shotgun focused build, but I can also see snipers, LMGs, and probably even pistols being great. While you might lose some dodge, you'll always have at least 55 when sprinting, which is still really, really good. Now, this build is not exactly without its flaws, and the main flaw is snipers. Your dodge is the only thing standing between you and getting one shot through all of your armor and health. If you think Anarchist doesn't do well with snipers, this build makes Anarchist look like Stoic. That said, I generally don't have too much of an issue with snipers as long as I play somewhat carefully and don't have too much desync. Now, how does this build compare to existing Zerk dodge setups? I would say it's somewhere in between Hacker and Rogue. Hacker suffers from the same inability to achieve good Zerk states, while Rogue suffers from being on the brink of death at every single moment. Both of these builds have their pros and cons, and throwing Copycat in the mix seems to result in three fairly different playstyles. The Pocket ECM will usually be much stronger than Copycat's 2 seconds, which is the main difference between it and Hacker. However, the 2 seconds is much more consistent than the Pocket ECM, which gives you a choice. Rogue, on the other hand, has nothing to keep it alive outside of the insane dodge, but it also has the ability to reach actually good Zerk values. I find Rogue has definitely the most weapon variety due to this, and probably feels the most unique, while the Copycat build and the Hacker build can be somewhat swapped between more freely. However, Copycat's version might be a little bit more new player friendly as there's no throwables to monitor or really understand how they work. When I just want to turn my brain off for a heist but I don't want to actually resort to using Hacker, this is the build that I pick. Up next is a build that just makes me a little bit sad. ICTV Hacker is one of my favorite builds these days, but it's not without its flaws. The Pocket ECM ruins any good Zerk, so you're pretty much just stuck with Frenzy Zerk all the time. However, the deck doesn't actually get a natural 2-shot ICTV either, leaving you with subpar options all around. You either bring Fax for quick fix, a loud weapon for underdog and just hope that it works, or you bring Frenzy and lose out on good Zerks. When I first saw Copycat, I was hoping it would somehow bridge the gap here, making one or all of these options much better, but how wrong I was. You can go full health with 2 natural 2-shot armor, and even more health than real Hacker. However, the Copycat PECM just doesn't heal you, which is a big upside of the real version. So Frenzy must be a lot better if there's no healing, right? But of course, Copycat comes to save the day with its fucking healing on headshot, ruining any hopes of that being any different than real Hacker. In the end, you have a side grade health option which doesn't rely on quick fix, comes with 2 seconds, but just doesn't heal as good. Or you can bring Frenzy and get 2 seconds of invincibility and slightly slower healing when you get downed or take a light shot. If I sound a bit disappointed, it's because I am. I would have loved to see Hacker keep the heal on PECM, even if it would have been a little bit OP. And of course the heal on headshot makes me want to end my fucking life, but I guess it could be worse. In all, I would say these versions of the builds are slightly more new player friendly than real ICTV Hacker, but only barely. Less micromanaging if you want to go with the health option, and you have 2 seconds if you go for Frenzy. That said, I do still enjoy playing the Copycat version, and I do consider it a reasonable side grade. However, most of the time I'm still going to go for basic Hacker. If you haven't played much ICTV Hacker since the buff, it might seem really gimmicky, however I can assure you that this feels like one of the most powerful armor builds in the game. Now the weapons, they might not exactly seem what I would consider optimal, but personally I really enjoy them. If you don't want to bring ammo bags, I'd recommend bringing the Mosconi Tactical instead of the Breaker, or even the Reinfeld 88. 255 and 500 snipers are of course also amazing on this build, but due to my lack of aim, I prefer shotguns. Okay, I know. I said full health Socio is a basic ass build, but I swear, this build, it's not like those other builds. The one card of Copycat that really had everyone interested on launch was the ability to reload your backup weapon. Most people went for the first weapon that everyone hates reloading, which is of course the Piglet. However, I simply don't really use the Piglet that much, so I skipped on to weapons that I personally hate reloading. That being the Vulcan and the HRL-7 rocket launcher. In my opinion, these are the two most annoying weapons to try to reload in the game, even more than the Piglet. The HRL-7, despite coming with the highest base damage of any weapon in the game, will normally only kill about as much as a single shot from the GL-40, but of course comes with a reload almost twice as long. For this reason, and a few others, it's almost never seen outside of new players making bad weapon builds, or people playing Safe House Nightmare. The Vulcan, on the other hand, while not nearly as slow per kill, does still reload in almost 8 seconds, which nobody wants to wait for. On top of that, I find builds that use these two cumbersome weapons in tandem to be quite enjoyable, and also just look a little silly. The basic idea of this build is to hug your ammo bag and swap weapons when you get Bulletstorm. With Unseen, the Vulcan is a beast of a weapon, and is your primary dozer killer. With Bulletstorm on top of that, you can do a ton of damage. Generally, I use it until I run out of ammo, then I proc Bulletstorm with the HRL-7, and go to town on every enemy I see. Then when that's out of ammo, your Vulcan will no doubt be reloaded, you can swap back. In theory, you'll never actually need to reload either weapon, but you know what they say. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there certainly is. As for the Copycat card, you could also bring Biker instead of Socio, but for performance, I would say Socio is a little bit better. The idea for both is that you can armor gate with the rocket launcher, as it can't proc Bullseye. However, Socio's gating is just a tad bit more consistent, and comes with a better health pool. The benefit to Biker though is that you could drop Hostage Taker aced, and maybe get aced unseen, or just a little bit more ammo. So how does this Socio build compare to the original one? Socio's melee boost has probably a bit more utility than what Copycat offers, especially due to neither of these weapons being too great against the dozers. I would also normally stick to just running one of these weapons at a time, either the Vulcan or the HRL by themselves. Picking one lets you get a little bit more skills for that certain weapon type, and usually bring a bit more ammo. The main benefit I see of this Copycat build is that you're able to bring both of these weapons together, have a pretty solid build, and use the weapons to kind of balance each other out. The HRL isn't too good without Bulletstorm, while the Vulcan really faces issues reloading without tons of buffs. So while the original build for these might be a little bit more powerful when they're alone, I would say that this Copycat build is definitely the best build that uses both of these weapons together. The final thing I would like to talk about is the HRL by itself. I said before that the weapon is rarely seen, and there's some pretty good reason for that. While in no ways would I say that it's a bad weapon, it's just mostly outclassed by pretty much everything else in the game, especially the Commando 101. Considering the HRL is basically the Thanatos of the explosive category, having the absolute worst fire rate but highest damage, it would be nice in my opinion to give it the main gimmick of the Thanatos, which is one-shotting dozers. To still keep it interesting, it would be cool if this was only possible if you directly hit the dozer instead of killing it with splash damage. No other explosive in the game actually takes projectile aim to that degree, which would give it a little bit of a unique feel. While it would still probably be worse than a vast majority of weapons, it would give it more of a reason to be used, even if that reason is just to have fun. Last up is a build recommended to me by the only Bay1K. I hope he doesn't mind using this in a video, but given his thoughts on the Copycat deck, I don't necessarily see him showcasing this anytime soon. This build might on paper seem like it's a side grade to CTV Armorer, or maybe even CTV Infiltrator, but I find that it's actually much more in line with being a side grade to ICTV Frenzy Muscle. While that might sound crazy, considering it's a 2-shot CTV build that has 2 seconds of invincibility that uses the Infiltrator card, however, the 2 seconds is incredibly unreliable given how it procs with 2-shot armor. This build also has the benefit of being able to tank 1 health shot even with Frenzy, which is something that a lot of people attribute to Muscle. The upside to the Copycat version is that the 2-shot health only needs Frenzy aced and Partners in Crime. While this is probably the build that improves upon the original build the most, it's also probably the weakest original build to begin with. Now, is this Copycat build good? Well, I probably wouldn't take it over CTV Armorer, but I would definitely take it over ICTV Frenzy Muscle. Now, does that mean it's good? Well, if the 2 seconds procced on Armor Break, it would arguably be one of the best armor builds in the whole game. Now again, does that actually mean that it's good? Well, it's definitely not bad. This is actually the only Copycat build I've used where the heal on headshot has been a positive. Considering you only need around 128 health to tank a single heavy shot, the measly 5 health per headshot is actually not that bad. If you keep up with killing, your health should also keep up. In theory, this can even outpace Hostage Taker on some lower health builds, but in practice I would say it's more on par with it, excluding during fades. You could certainly build for Hostage Taker and drop some of the DPS skills, but at that point, why not just run this build with ICTV instead? Now that wraps up all the interesting builds that I could come up with for Copycat. I'm sure there's more out there and I'm just not creative enough to think of them, but this is the best I got for now. Of course there are tons of other serviceable builds, but I find that they all pretty much play the same despite using different final cards. That doesn't mean that they aren't good, but they aren't what I would consider to be super unique, and not necessarily interesting enough that I wanted to show them in this video. If anyone thinks that I missed some cool ones, definitely feel free to comment them on this video or send them to me somehow. I'd love to hear about other actually interesting builds for this deck, as I would definitely like more reasons to play it. I bet there are certain ones out there that I just haven't really been able to think of. I've been wanting to mess around a little bit with the standalone throwables, especially the ones that are clearly weaker than the real decks, but I haven't really been able to come up with anything cool for those. If you came here expecting basic powerful builds, then I would recommend trying to run the Grinder card with max health, the Socio setup I showed except use real weapons, run Anarchist with max dodge, or run the Burglar setup I showed, just don't bring Frenzy. You could even try running Hitman with 1 armor card and 3 health with ICTV. More talented YouTube creators than I have already made videos about pretty much all of these builds, so I didn't feel like I would be adding anything by going over them here.